The first sentence of Pride and Prejudice is one of the most famous opening sentences in all of literature. As is usually the case with literary quotes, however, the significance of that first sentence is much greater in the context of the novel than just as a witty saying on its own. So let's look at that first sentence. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. What do we learn about the novel from this sentence, which admittedly is pretty funny on its own? First of all, we learn about the world that the novel inhabits. A single man in possession of a good fortune is a phrase that applies to Mr. Bingley here, but could easily apply to Mr. Darcy as well. In fact, almost all of the characters in the novel are people of good fortunes. As I discussed in another lecture, this novel lives almost entirely in the world of the very wealthy, and this sentence alerts us to that fact. But we learn much more from this sentence. We learn that two issues will be especially important to the plot of the novel: marriage and money. Really, what we learn is that the interaction of marriage and money, the way one affects the other, will be the principal concern of the novel. The point of the sentence is that wealthy young gentlemen are very desirable marriage material. As we talked about in another lecture, that desirability has to do with both the restrictions of social class on marriage and with the sometimes legal difficulty inherent in females inheriting property from their parents. What's interesting about the sentence, though, is that's not really what it says. It actually doesn't say that wealthy young gentlemen are in high demand in this society. In fact, it says just the opposite. It says that wealthy young gentlemen are themselves always in need of wives. In other words, the first sentence of the novel is ironic, and it's a signal to the reader concerning the tone and style of the novel overall. So, what exactly is irony? It's actually a commonly misunderstood term, and in my opinion, Alanis Morissette back in the early 90s didn't help things.
The traffic jam, when you're already late, a no smoking sign on your cigarette break. It's like 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife. It's meeting the man of my dreams, and then meeting his beautiful wife. And isn't it ironic? Don't you think? A little too ironic. And yeah, I really do think.
Irony isn't really about unexpected bad luck. It's always about a manipulation of expectations in some way. There are actually several different kinds of irony, but the irony in this first sentence is called verbal irony, which is a statement that says one thing but means something else. That might sound like a definition of sarcasm, and sarcasm is, in fact, a form of irony. But verbal irony doesn't always have the bite of sarcasm. Sometimes it's more gentle, as in this first sentence. Austen here isn't really being sarcastic, but she is stating something in a deliberately misleading way, and doing so for comedic effect. She's making a joke, in other words, about the attitudes of people like Mrs. Bennet, who seem to consider wealthy young gentlemen nothing more than prospective husbands for their daughters. The first scene of the novel extends this joke, mainly in the character of Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet likes to tease his wife, which is what he's doing in this first scene. When she tells him that Mr. Bingley is moving into the neighborhood, Mr. Bennet asks what that has to do with him, though he surely knows exactly what she's getting at. When Mrs. Bennet explains that she's thinking of him marrying one of their daughters, Mr. Bennet basically asks, "Oh, is that why he's moving here?" Obviously, that's not why Mr. Bingley has moved into the area, and Mr. Bennet knows that. But Mr. Bennet likes a good joke more than almost anything else, and he's especially good at statements of verbal irony. That first scene, including the first sentence, is, again, a signal to the readers about the kind of novel that Pride and Prejudice is. It's actually a very funny book at times. Often the humor in the book comes from Austen making fun of various social conventions of the world of the very wealthy, as she does in that first sentence. But it's important to understand that Pride and Prejudice isn't a satire. The humor that Austen creates is almost always soft, not biting. She seems to understand that the emphasis placed on marriage in this society, and as well as the specific way in which the conventions of marriage work, is silly, maybe even ridiculous, but she also accepts it as simply a part of life. She doesn't criticize girls like Jane and Elizabeth for trying to find husbands. She doesn't even criticize men like Mr. Darcy for being careful about the social class of his prospective wife. She's a realist who understands that these are simply the rules that this society lives by, And so while she does enjoy poking fun at the more ridiculous aspects of that world, she's not really satirizing that world or even those rules overall. I said earlier that there are multiple forms of irony, and in fact, Pride and Prejudice uses some of those other forms as well. The most notable is what's usually called situational irony, which is when things turn out differently than you expect. I think, really, that's what Alanis Morissette is talking about in her song, though, to be honest, I still think she gets it pretty much wrong. The way that the novel makes use of situational irony is really interesting, and it's a key component not only to its style, but also to its main ideas. Specifically, the novel uses situational irony regarding the main character's understanding of themselves and of each other. Jane Austen's original title for this novel was First Impressions. And even after reading just Volume 1, it's not hard to see why. One of the main drivers of the plot of the novel is the way characters originally misunderstand each other. Obviously, the most important characters in this regard are Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. When they first meet at the ball in Chapter 3, Mr. Darcy says of Elizabeth that, quote, she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And not long after, Elizabeth says to her mother that she feels sure she can promise that she will never dance with Mr. Darcy. Now, we've seen enough Hollywood movies based on plots like this one, so we can already tell that they're probably going to end up falling in love, making both of those statements untrue. But it's not just the statements that are ironic, it's their understanding of each other. Elizabeth, especially, is prone to false impressions of people. She believes Darcy to be a proud and hateful person, only to find out later that he's actually very kind and personable, or at least he is once you get to know him. Later, she'll form a false first impression of the character Mr. Wickham, believing that he is an innocent victim of Mr. Darcy's ill treatment, when in fact he's a pretty nasty character who has treated Mr. Darcy's family really badly. These characterizations, then, are ironic, in that we expect Mr. Darcy to be a conceited jerk, and we expect Mr. Wickham to be a nice guy, when in fact they're each the opposite. That's where the prejudice in the title comes in. Remember that prejudice literally means prejudging. And there's a lot of prejudging here, judging before the character actually knows what they're talking about. One of my favorite early scenes in the novel occurs in Chapter 3 when Mr. Darcy first appears at the ball. In this scene, Austen pokes fun at the way people's impressions of others are based so strongly on initial appearances. She says, Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, his handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity. For he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased. And not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. Just as quickly as the crowd forms a positive opinion of Mr. Darcy, in other words, based almost entirely on his looks and the fact that he's extremely wealthy, they turn on him and form a very negative opinion, based almost entirely on his manners. Austen's having a pretty good time in this paragraph, humorously pointing out how quickly we form impressions and how quickly those impressions can change. Neither impression is really accurate, of course. He's neither as admirable as they first believe him to be, nor as disagreeable as they later decide he is, but that's because they don't really know him. The crowd is trying to form opinions based on no real knowledge of Mr. Darcy's character. That tendency, which we probably all share to some degree, is one of Austen's main interests in the novel. Elizabeth and Charlotte Lucas discuss this very idea as it relates to marriage in Chapter 6. In this scene, Charlotte is arguing that Jane needs to be more open about her attraction to Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth counters that Jane can't even be sure of her own feelings since they've spent so little time together. Charlotte suggests that they've spent 4 evenings together, which is enough to learn quite a bit about each other. Yes, replies Elizabeth, these 4 evenings have enabled them to ascertain that they both like vingt un better than commerce. Vingt un and commerce are card games. So basically, this Elizabeth's response says that all they've really learned about each other is their taste in card games and other kinds of entertainment. If we go back to the first chapter then, we can see again how Austen is making fun of the way Mrs. Bennet is planning for one of her daughters to marry Mr. Bingley, a man she has never even met. For her, the fact that Mr. Bingley is wealthy is enough, since he therefore offers a solution to their future financial difficulties. We're clearly supposed to find Mrs. Bennet's attitude a little ridiculous. But later in the novel, when Charlotte Lucas agrees to marry for her own financial comfort, it's harder to tell what we're supposed to think about her decision. And that's one of the elements that makes this novel so enjoyable to read. Austen is asking us to find the irony, find the humor, in the way the characters in the novel form quick impressions, but also the way that we, as readers, do exactly the same thing.